Melinda Jarrett, the Executive Director of the Fredericton Region Museum. I'd like to welcome everyone to the third virtual presentation in the York Sunbury Historical Society Speaker Series, featuring Dr. Jane Jenkins, who will be speaking tonight on the flu pandemic in New Brunswick during Christmas 1918. First of all, I'm going to ask Dr. Sasha Mullally to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Mullally is the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at UNB, and she has a PhD from the University of Toronto, where she specialized in the history of health and medicine. She currently teaches at the University of New Brunswick as well.
Okay, thank you, Melinda. I'm just delighted to have been asked to introduce my good colleague, Jane Jenkins, tonight, a retired professor at St. Thomas University, where she was the longtime director of the Science and Technology Studies program. She remains a member of the graduate academic unit and an adjunct in my home department, history, at the University of New Brunswick. And we are really delighted to share Jane Jenkins with St. Thomas because she's a widely recognized expert in the social history of science and medicine. And she's got a longstanding expertise in the history of public health, in disease control, and an interest in how communities respond economically, institutionally, politically, and of course, socially to the challenges of public health. And these are challenges that I think we can all appreciate in our current moment. So she pursues her research program with a focus, of course, on New Brunswick, on our province. But her research also examines regional and Canadian health history. And I know from listening to previous talks that she's given that it also moves back and forth across the Canada-US border as she traces intellectual threads and professional careers of many health professionals, a lot of advocates, a lot of health reformers who were very active in shaping what would become our public health institutions and policies and programs and departments over the long turn of the last century. And of course, these are the interests that lay the foundation for a current book project, which I want to put on everyone's radar screen. And this, of course, is a book about the experience of the 1918 influenza epidemic in New Brunswick, but it's also about the establishment of the province's first Department of Health, which Dr. Jenkins was among the first to point out that it was the first provincial standalone Department of Health established in Canada and perhaps the British Empire, but we'll let her speak to that. And I bring this to our attention by way of introduction because it's one example of how Dr. Jenkins is always able to put New Brunswick on the map. And of course, she makes our history meaningful to us, but we live here. But she takes the history of the province and makes it meaningful within broader national and international historical contexts, sometimes set against extraordinary events like the Great War. And I'll add that she does this in a lively, evocative style underpinned by meticulous research. And her paper tonight is going to go one step even further than this because it places her research in the appropriate holiday season, as suggested by her title, Caroling in a Crisis. So because I know we're all going to be both educated and entertained tonight, I'm going to stop. And without anything more from me, I'm going to cede the virtual floor to our speaker, Dr. Jane Jenkins. Jane, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sasha. Thank you also to the York Sunbury Regional Museum and the Historical Society. I'm very happy to be here with you this evening, although I wish we could all be together in one large meeting room. I mean, I wish I could be looking out at your faces. Of course, the pandemic of COVID-19 prevents that. This pandemic has caused tremendous disruptions in our lives. Who knew we would all become so proficient in Zoom? It really has disrupted our lives in significant ways, many of which will be very far-reaching, I'm sure. And as Sasha indicated, as we are approaching the Christmas season, we're going to face some new challenges. And I mean, Christmas is so wrapped up in traditions that highlight the coming together of families, the coming together of communities. And that stands in such sharp contrast to the pandemic restrictions that we face, social distancing. We can kind of bring social distancing into the holiday spirit by suggesting that we need to stand one reindeer length apart from each other. But we have to deal with small household bubbles, and this is a lot to deal with, and this will be a challenge for us as we begin this holiday season of 2020. So it makes really good sense. It seems very obvious that we would go back and we would want to look at how people in 1918 facing a pandemic as well, how did they deal with facing a Christmas season? So I'm going to spend about the next 35 minutes talking to you about this, and I look forward to any questions or comments you may have after that. So in 1918, in December, New Brunswick was in the second wave of a global pandemic. Now, as Christmas came, it was not an idyllic picture. The picture I'm going to paint for you tonight of what it was like in Christmas in New Brunswick in 1918 is not going to look like this picture that you see on this screen right now, because of course the epidemic was not the only disruption that people were facing, because when the epidemic swept into New Brunswick in late September and early October of 1918, World War I was still on, the so-called war to end all wars. And I mean, ironically, when the war had begun in August of 1914, pundits at the time had cheerfully predicted that the war would be over by Christmas. Now they meant Christmas of 1914, of course. And here it was 4 years later, and people were expecting to spend another Christmas in wartime. And this page from the St. John Globe, I think, really sums up what people were dealing with, these two disruptions, significant disruptions in their lives. On the one hand, people are pondering, when will it end? They've faced food shortages and relentless appeals for victory bonds, which is what this on the right-hand side, what that is all about. They've suffered the tragic losses of young men, soldiers, young women, nurses, of other family members. And at the same time, they're dealing, as you can see on the left, in the left-hand column, they're dealing with a new influenza that has just hit. This is the St. Croix Courier, October 10th, 1918. And you can again see in this column here, a story about a young woman, 39 years old, who died very suddenly from pneumonia, which was the result of influenza. Right next to an article providing excerpts from letters written by soldiers who were overseas in France. One of them writes, "Just a few lines to let you know I'm still alive." And then on the other side, of course, an article about a soldier who had died, Harlan Grimmer, who died August 29th of 1918 at the age of 26. And next to that, a report that Spanish influenza controls the town. You can see the same thing in this newspaper. By the way, in 1918, there were 44 newspapers in New Brunswick, and they have been a tremendous source of information for me. But this one too, you can see the headline here indicating that churches, schools, and theaters will be closed by the Provincial Department of Health. And there's reporting on the war. So these two significant, shattering, overwhelming events occurring simultaneously. And again, here in the Daily Gleaner, lists of casualties, killed in action, those who died of wounds, and most heartbreaking, I think, those who were wounded and missing. Next to another report about the closure of schools and churches and theaters. At that time, when the epidemic arrived in New Brunswick, there were only two public health officials. These two men, Dr. William F. Roberts, who was the first Minister of Health in New Brunswick, and Dr. George Melvin, who was the first Chief Medical Officer of Health. These two men had trained together and received their medical degrees from one of the most prestigious medical schools in the world in New York City. And they had come back to New Brunswick, to their hometown of St. John, and they worked together there to reform the city and to try to change legislation dealing with all manner of things associated with public health, regulating food production and sewage systems, and trying to get clean water supplies. And they then decided that they would try to institute the same kind of reforms province-wide. And so Roberts ran for a seat in the provincial legislature, which he won. And he set out with the explicit goal of establishing a Department of Health and putting in legislation that would establish a very centralized, very powerful Department of Health. And this was the Public Health Act of 1918 that did indeed give sweeping powers to the Minister of Health. Well, as it turned out, and completely by coincidence, this Public Health Act of 1918 passed into law just days before the first cases of influenza swept into the province. And William Roberts was the Minister of Health, and he used the sweeping powers in that act to shut the province down. He passed this proclamation that closed schools, theaters, and churches effective Friday, October 11th, until further notice. And by late October, there were thousands of cases of influenza across the province. There were only about 350,000 people in the province at that time. And there were tens of thousands of people suffering from influenza. You can see in the far left column, the grip situation. Grip was a synonym for influenza at the time. The grip situation is developing into a very serious one. They are having difficulty getting nurses. The physicians were worked to exhaustion. On the column on the right, you can see that there are only 5 women who were well enough to work at the telephone office. Telephone service was quite disrupted because 16 of the other operators were sick at home with the influenza. And then in the middle, you see that the war is still very much happening. William Harris has been killed in action. Lance Corporal Baxter has been wounded, and Private Fred Harris has been gassed. Now, people are taking preventative measures. They're making masks just like we are today. And you can see the one on the right was designed by someone in St. John. And you can see that there's a tube with disinfectant in it that is hooked up into the mouthpiece, and it's intended to slowly drip disinfectant down into the mouth. But you can also see that the nose is unprotected at all. So this was probably quite elaborate, but ultimately quite ineffective. The one on the left was probably maybe a bit better, but still somewhat ineffective because it was made of ordinary cheesecloth that has a very coarse weave, and certainly wouldn't have kept out the influenza virus. There were many medications and therapies being promoted. There's really a strong evidence that the Spanish influenza was being leveraged by people who were selling commercial therapies and medications. They definitely leveraged the Spanish influenza to sell things like Wampol's paraformic lozenges or Johnson's anodyne liniment. And also to sell things like onions. Onions had actually been used as a preventative against epidemics since the time of the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages. And here we see it again being promoted. The flu was also leveraged by shopkeepers who were selling clothing. And they had been allowed to stay open. The closure orders had required churches and schools and theaters to close. The shops had been allowed to stay open, but they had definitely experienced a drop in their clientele, in their customers, and they were trying to pull them back in, and they used the flu, the one on the left. Forget the flu. Chances are all in favor of persons who do not fear the demic. Turn your thoughts to fall and winter clothing. And the one on the right that suggests that because all of the theaters and the bowling alleys are closed and there's nothing left to do but snore, you might as well do so in pussy willow pajamas and nightshirts. So you can see the marketing of the influenza to sell material goods here. Now, by early November, there's some measure of optimism on both the pandemic front and on the war front, because it looks like peace is about to emerge from this terrible war. And in mid-November as well, the closure orders are lifted in New Brunswick, and the churches and the schools and the theaters can reopen. And of course, just a few days later, November 11th, the armistice is signed and the war is over. So now there's victory. And we see that, again, the leveraging of now not the influenza, but now victory in order to market, in this case, furniture. Now, I'm going to read this ad to you, but I'll give you a warning that there are some very strong, some very bitter feelings evident in this. Every household should signalize our glorious victory over the Huns by buying some good, substantial piece of furniture at Le Mans. In after years, you will point to this piece of furniture and say, we bought that in November 1918 at the end of the greatest war in all history, when after 4 years of struggle, the arrogant, brutal, murderous Prussians were at last brought to their knees. So you can see undercurrent of grief and suffering that people were experiencing at that time. But there was an attempt to turn thoughts to Christmas, and Christmas began to be leveraged in order to market and sell material goods. Here are some front pages of 2 New Brunswick newspapers showing the great focus on Christmas. And Christmas had been mobilized in Western culture for very specific social purposes. I mean, it was used to cement social bonds, to solidify ideals of family and what family meant and what it should be, to solidify and cement ideals of community and notions of goodwill and charity and peace. And in wartime, and not just during the First World War, but often in war times, Christmas is mobilized to promote patriotism. And I'll give you some examples of this in a few minutes. Christmas in the early 20th century was also used to promote consumerism. And we see at this time the beginning of the commercialization of Christmas. So there were a lot of ads in the newspapers throughout New Brunswick with timely hints and helps for what people should buy. Clothes were quite popular items, suggestions. It's interesting to also see how the gifts were very gendered. There were specific gifts for men, gifts that men would appreciate. Often clothes. Here's another example of a gendered advertisement: buy the man's gift at a man's store. And of course, the ads for women, particularly for wives, were typically labor-saving devices to really emphasize the role of the wife in the household. And of course, what every woman would want, ovenware, carpet sweepers, and cooking utensils. There were ads for new technologies, the new technologies of cameras and the so-called talking machines, the new record players. These would have been deemed to be quite luxurious items, but the war was over and there were ads for food. After the food shortages of the war, there were luxury items like figs and grapefruits available for Christmas time. So you can see some sense of optimism emerging after the terrible wartime. The influenza epidemic is still raging in New Brunswick at this time. There are gifts for kids that you can see: Christmas bells for horse-drawn sleighs and the ubiquitous sleds for kids. My favorite ad of all is the Frank Doucette one, which has everything. They have games and toys, they have decorations, they have heaps of toys. And for the early shoppers, they have a free horse. You can imagine just how children seeing this would be dragging their parents down to the Doucette store to get something for Christmas from then. But still, the war is ever present. In the middle there, with just a few days before Christmas, there's Christmas cheer rampant at the military hospital. The soldiers who had returned to Canada with wounds were convalescing in the military hospital, which is today Old Government House. And in the Christmas season, many of them were given leave to go and visit their families, the ones that were healthy enough to leave. But in the far left column, you can see other soldiers are returning. 2 brothers are returning to New Brunswick, but they left 2 of their other brothers in graves in France. Soldiers are coming back. This is an event for great excitement and anticipation. This article reports that 2 steamers are about to dock in St. John after leaving England. It took soldiers on these troop ships about a week to get from England over to Halifax or dock in St. John. And there would be lists of the names of the soldiers who were on the different ships. And people would be looking at these and perusing them to find a name of a relative. But of course, there were still soldiers overseas, and people had been used to sending their soldier relatives gifts at Christmas time. And this is an ad that would have typically appeared every year at Christmas time during the war. But because the war had just recently ended, and because the transfer of soldiers back to Canada was not complete, people were still sending Christmas packages overseas. And some of the soldiers were still overseas because they were in convalescent hospitals there. This is the number 3 Canadian hospital in France that was run by physicians from McGill University. And you can see it's taken at Christmas time. There's greenery around the doors, the large maple leaf on the wall. Can't quite see it in the picture, but it says the maple leaf forever. Now, sometimes families would get information about their loved ones who were in these hospitals, but very few details. Lucky people in New Brunswick received Christmas cards like this one. This was a card sent by Hugh Wright, who was from Hopewell Rock in New Brunswick. He was with the 4th Canadian Siege Battery, and they received these cards to send home. For all that is best and brightest, pray accept warmest and sincerest wishes. May Christmastide bring no sorrow, and the new year herald glad tidings of victory and of an abiding peace. Now, Hugh Wright, by the way, he returned home and he ended up being a lightkeeper on Grindstone Island in the Bay of Fundy. But that same Christmas in 1918, he sent this home as well. Although it's not explicitly Christmas related, it's very evocative. These were cross stitchings that locals in France and Belgium would make for the soldiers, sell to them, and the soldiers would then send them home. You can see the Union Jack surrounded on either side by the flags of France and Belgium. And it says, "We'll be happy once again, never mind." And there's just something so heartbreaking about that. Getting this at Christmas time. The war was ever present, and so many of the stores were advertising gifts that they deemed to be useful. Edgecombs, the store for useful gifts, make this a joyous yet patriotic Christmas. The war was still reverberating so predominantly in the lives of people at the time that shopkeepers didn't want to push it too far. They didn't want to have displays that were too ostentatious. They didn't want to lose touch of the fact that the war was still a presence. And so after 4 years of scarcity, 4 years of austerity, they wanted people to buy, but to do so in a useful in a practical way. And there are a lot of ads for these kind of useful Christmas gifts. Furniture was one of the ones that was deemed apparently most useful. But of course, in December, the influenza pandemic is still on. The article on the left is from the Daily Gleaner on December the 27th, and it recounts the story of two young men who were 18 years old and 22 years old. They had been working in a lumber camp, returned to their home in Burt's Corner when they fell ill with influenza. And the younger brother died on New Year's Eve. The elder died on Christmas Eve, and the elder died on Christmas Day, and their sister was also dying. You can see that they're advocating the use of masks still at that time. And on the right, the weatherman was not cooperating to make a very Merry Christmas. The weather was miserable. I mean, the weather actually is a very useful historical tool. It tells us a lot about what people might have been able to do, what people wouldn't have been able to do. And so I find weather reports to be quite interesting. They add a really rich element to my understanding of the context of the times. And Christmas Eve of 1918 was snowing, but it wasn't any kind of snow that looked like that first slide that I showed you. It wasn't an idyllic kind of Christmas card kind of snow. It was sleet, the hard, coarse, sharp pellets that sting your face when you're out in it. And although there were a few inches of snow on the ground on Christmas morning, it warmed up a little bit and it started to rain. And then it started to sleet. And so all of the events that had been scheduled for Christmas Day to try to raise people's spirits in the face of the pandemic, in the face of the tragedy of the war, had to be canceled. The river on the St. John River was frozen. The ice had frozen such that there was ice skating and people were out playing curling matches, but all of that had to be canceled. There was no caroling that Christmas Eve, and the weather was very emblematic of the gloomy, brooding kind of tone of that particular holiday season. And it was summed up, I think, in an editorial. I'll just read you a few lines. This was the Christmas editorial written on December 24th. And the editor said, "Christmas, though a time of joy, especially for the young, is for those of riper years a season of retrospect and of suggestion. In wartime, this function is made heavy with sorrow for the lost. The toll of death has been enormous. It may be doubted whether for any of us it is possible to associate mirth with our Christmas keeping." So just by way of conclusion, if I had to characterize Christmas in 1918, I think you can see on the left, there was a yearning for peace, for normalcy, for goodwill toward men. There was a yearning for that you can palpably see in the Christmas greeting from the Headquarters for Useful Christmas Gifts on the right. May all the shadows of unhappiness which may have come to you during the past 4 years be blotted out with the sunshine of good things, which will be yours in the peaceful days to come. I mean, these people were facing two disruptive, overwhelming events, a global war, a global pandemic. Both of them had caused the traumatic, the sudden deaths of young people. Now, in the end, the war overshadowed everything, including the influenza pandemic. And eventually in time, of course, we know that the war and the end of war was memorialized. Our Remembrance Day is November 11th, the end of the First World War. But the influenza pandemic fell very, very quickly out of public memory. Even though more people died worldwide in the influenza pandemic in 10 months than had died during the entire 4 years of the World War, it was forgotten. It's almost as though there was so much tragedy. These two events together were too heavy a load to carry, and something had to be jettisoned, and people forgot the influenza epidemic. It wasn't really brought back into public memory until the 1970s or the 1980s, when there was a fear of another pandemic coming around. And at that time, in the 70s and 80s, people referred to the 1918 influenza pandemic as the forgotten pandemic, because it really was a lost memory. So, and just to close, I think I haven't painted a very cheerful picture here of what it was like back in 1918 at Christmas time, but it's important to note that people got through it. It was not a cheerful time for them by any means. But I think it's helpful for us, because I think that today, even though we too are faced with an overwhelming and disruptive pandemic, I think we'll have a much better time coping with getting through Christmas. We have Zoom, we have FaceTime. Our Christmas is going to be perhaps unfamiliar and different for sure, but I think we'll be just fine, because the pandemic is going to end as the one in 1918 ended. So with that, I will end my presentation and wish you all Merry Christmas and happy holiday season. And with that, I will pass it back to Melinda.
Well, thank you very much for this great presentation, and also to Dr. Mullally for her introduction of our speaker. If you have a question, now is the time to ask. So I'm going to start with the first question. And so our first question this evening is from Jim Whalen, and is very interesting. He said, how many people died in New Brunswick from the flu pandemic?
Hi, Jim. Well, the population, as I said, was about 350,000 people. And it's estimated that about 1,500 people died from influenza. Now, that is probably an underestimate, because record keeping was difficult. As I said, the physicians, the doctors were worked off their feet, and the Minister of Health, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, were asking for the doctors to send reports and to send in numbers of cases. And they managed to get some of the numbers in, and the reporting was done. So the official number is about 1,600 deaths, but I suspect it was higher than that. Nonetheless, New Brunswick suffered the second lowest mortality rate of all provinces in Canada. And I believe that's because William F. Roberts put those closure orders in place so quickly. In a way, he did exactly what our public health officials did in 2020 by creating the Atlantic bubble. They just closed the borders, and that's exactly what Roberts did, and that prevented more deaths.
Did anybody keep a record of the people who actually died from that epidemic?
Do you mean the actual names of people?
Yes.
Yes, there are some. I mean, they were reported in newspapers. You can find the names of people in newspapers. Some of the documents from the Department of Health were unfortunately lost in a fire in the 1920s. So the best place to find the actual names of people is in diaries that people had, and in publicly available in the newspapers of New Brunswick.
Thank you very much, Jim. Two very important questions. Now, Ardith McGuire has a question. She wanted to know, how long did the influenza epidemic last?
In 1918, the second wave of influenza began in late September, early October, and it lasted only 4 months until late January of 1919. There was a third wave that came in the late spring of 1919, but it was very, very mild. There was a first wave that had come in the spring of 1918. It too was very mild. So there was a mild first wave, a 4-month second wave, which was the severe wave, and then a very mild third wave. So in total, all 3 waves lasted from the spring of 1918 to the late spring of 1919, a total of just over a year.
Thank you for the answer to that question, Dr. Jenkins. Now, Don Stevenson wants to know, are there records of the Canadian soldiers who contracted the flu while serving overseas in the First World War?
There are records of the different units, and as someone was telling me, that was Charles Ferris, I believe, who was mentioning last night when we were talking of a unit in France where it was reported that a large number of the soldiers came down with the influenza. Was that you, Charles? Are you there?
It was part of the Uncle Si's War publication of the Gregg Center, where Major Inches reports that almost everyone in his heavy artillery battery came down with the influenza in June of 1918.
Thank you, Charles. So the next question that we have to ask, and it's the last one so far in the chat. This is from Russ Hunt. He says, do you think the war was the main reason that the flu was forgotten, or were there other reasons it dropped out of public view so quickly?
I think that's a fascinating question, Russ. There is a lot of work that's been done on collective memories and public memorialization, and what we as societies choose to memorialize, choose to build monuments to, and what we want to forget and shift aside and not look at. Susan Sontag wrote extensively about this, and there's been, of course, a lot of work on this recently because of what has been chosen to, you know, the statues that have become so controversial. So it's an interesting question to explore why the influenza pandemic was forgotten. I think that the war was a big part of it. I think that there really was so much trauma caused by the war and by the pandemic that it was simply too much to deal with. I mean, you can see that in individual lives. And I think that the war is quite a contributing factor in explaining why the influenza pandemic fell out of public memory. But it's a complicated issue, interesting one. I've explored a little bit in some of my publications, because in New Brunswick, it's interesting that William F. Roberts, the first Minister of Health and the first Chief Medical Officer of Health, they too have fallen out of public memory. Nobody in New Brunswick knows their names. They've been forgotten. Now, why have they been forgotten? You know, is it because in New Brunswick we have an inferiority complex? We don't like to have heroes? I mean, if they'd been Ontario, maybe they would have been heroes. But in New Brunswick, we've forgotten them. So it's a complicated problem, and I don't have a simple answer for it. But it's a great question.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. I have a couple of more questions in the chat have come up. Marianne Bell wants to know, how did the pandemic come to an end? Were any vaccinations provided?
No, they didn't have effective vaccinations in 1918 against the influenza. There were people who were trying to formulate vaccinations for sure, because vaccines were not unknown at the time. There had been an effective vaccine developed for smallpox, and working on the germ theory of disease, they believed that they could try to formulate a vaccine for influenza. Different vaccines were tried. They were not effective. So that's not how it ended. It just cycled out of the ecological landscape, as is often the case with, you know, flu season every year comes and goes, and then it just cycles out. And that's what happened in 1918.
I see Richard Yeomans has unmuted his mic, so I'm assuming that means he wants to ask a question.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much, Melinda. And thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for a great presentation. My question for you is about the Public Health Act of 1918. What kind of debate was going on in the House about giving a brand new department the kind of powers that they were about to enact? And this is ahead of the pandemic even actually starting in the province. Was there a great deal of opposition? I'm thinking particularly from the office of the Premier, about willing to hand over those reins?
It's a great question, and it was fascinating to follow the process of trying to get this bill through the legislature. The debate was unseemly. It was vociferous. It was wild and crazy. There was a huge amount of opposition to this act. And there was even some opposition from within Robert's own party, the Liberal Party. He was worried that he was going to, they had a small minority, and he was worried that the members of his party would vote against the bill. The main objections were, as you noted, that it gave too much power to one minister. Another objection was that it was going to cost a huge amount of money, and it was not going to generate any money for the government. At a time when health matters were deemed to be better handled privately in the family home, it was unusual, and it seemed odd that the government should be taking over that responsibility. So those are the main reasons why people objected to the bill. Roberts wrote after it passed, it just barely passed with, I think, 1 or 2 votes. And he said that it was the hardest battle he had ever fought. And he felt like he had been at war all the times that he faced the opposition to this bill. It was a hard fought battle for him.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Now I see that Gillian Thompson and Gail Campbell, all the way up Victoria, British Columbia, have a question to ask. And I'd just like to note that we have people here tonight from Italy, Newfoundland, British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, all over the country. And I'm not sure, there may be some people from the US.
We wondered if Jane would have a comment about whether there was epidemic or pandemic denial at work in, if not New Brunswick, then more generally. Was anybody a denier in 1918, 1919?
The denial of the epidemic in 1918 came after it had ended. It was almost like a denial that it had ever happened. But at the time, I haven't found a lot of people who were denying that it was happening. I think that it was so evident. I mean, people were literally dying in the streets. And there wasn't a lack, as there is today, perhaps, a lack of trust in what was being reported in the newspapers. And so when people read in the newspapers, which was their only source of information about what was happening around the world, when they read that influenza was coming into Boston or New York, they believed it. They didn't have a notion of fake media. So the denial really emerges after the fact.
One more question. And this is another question from Marianne Bell, and it is in our chat. And she asked, was there a particular age group that saw higher death rates in this pandemic, the elderly? And she's mentioning specifically those poor brothers who died in the woods and their sister. It suggests younger people passed away.
Yes, and that's actually the case. One of the reasons why the 1918 influenza epidemic was so shocking was it seemed to strike young people more than infants or the elderly. I mean, in that sense, it went against the usual influenza that people were familiar with, but it had very much strongest, most severe impact on people who were in their late teens, their 20s, and their 30s. Epidemiologically, they've been trying to figure out what the specifics of this particular influenza were that it attacked young people, but it did indeed. The 2 young brothers from Bert's Corner were the typical kind of largest age group of people who succumbed to this disease.
Well, I think that that's our last question, and I'd like to say thank you very much, Dr. Jenkins, for your making the 3rd presentation in the York Sunbury Historical Society Speaker Series, or in our virtual series. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at the Fredericton Region Museum by email at frederictonregionmuseum@gmail.com or by phone at 506-455-6041. You can also contact us through our website at frederictonregionmuseum.com or check us out on our Facebook. And we'll be seeing you again in January 2021.